Okay, your brain. Your brain is amazing when you think about it. It weighs about 3 pounds. It sits inside the skull of your head, and it determines everything about you. Who you are, what you like, what your past experiences have been, how you relate to the world today. Your high school graduation, it's in there, right? The day that you were born, I suppose it's in there too. Everything that makes you, you is in your brain. So your brain's doing a lot of work. While it only accounts for about 2% of the weight of your whole body, so you could say it accounts for about 2% of your body, it takes 25% of the energy that you consume. So 25% of the calories that you eat go to feeding your brain. Here I've shown 2 different pictures. One is a cartoon of the outside of the brain that's divided up into a few different areas that we'll talk about shortly. The other is some special brain imaging and analyses that allow us to see what parts of the brain are connected to other parts. So each of those lines, you can think of them as a sort of road or pathway. All right. Right there is a picture of someone holding a human brain in their hands. What can you see? Well, you can see the blood vessels that are on top of the brain, but the outer part that you can see, that's called the cerebral cortex. And cortex means bark, like the bark on a tree. So cerebral cortex is essentially brain bark, right? It's the outer layer of your brain. And that's the part of your brain that contains the cell bodies of the neurons that we were talking about in the previous lecture. So the cerebral cortex is the part of your brain that does all sorts of computations. It's a very, very important part of your brain. It's where your thoughts and decisions and your likes and dislikes all live. Now, if we take a step back, you may have heard the phrases white matter and gray matter when people are talking about the brain. Well, white matter is just myelin, that fatty tissue that we talked about before, the insulation around your axons. That's white matter. So anywhere you have an axon that's insulated with myelin, that appears as white matter. The cell bodies in the cerebral cortex doesn't have myelin around it. So your cerebral cortex is gray matter, right? No myelin, gray matter. It's not only cell bodies, it's also axons that go distances that are so short that there's no reason for them to have myelin. There's no reason to speed them up. Now, one thing you may have noticed is that your brain is really wrinkly, right? It's got these valleys and peaks. It's really strange. Why is your brain so wrinkled? Well, it turns out that wrinkling increases the amount of brain bark or cerebral cortex that you've got by a factor of 3. Why is it so important to get all of that cerebral cortex in there? Well, how much cerebral cortex you have determines how much computing power or power of analyses your brain has. The more computing power you've got, the better of a brain you've got. So you really want to get as much cerebral cortex in there as you can, and wrinkling is the way that your brain does that. If your brain didn't solve, or Mother Nature didn't solve this problem by wrinkling, well, the other alternative would be to have a brain that's spherical, like our eyeballs, right? It's like an orange. And just to have that cerebral cortex around the outside of that orange. If you did that, then your brain would have to be 3 times the volume it is now. So that would mean you would have this giant head like a space alien. Just ask your mother what it would mean if your head was 3 times the size it is now. It would mean you wouldn't be born, because no woman can give birth to a head that big, right? So thank your mother, because your head was big enough as it is, but the wrinkling is what allows you to have a big brain without essentially killing your mother. I'm sure there was a better way to say that, but hopefully you know what I mean. With all these wrinkles, there are these peaks and valleys, and neuroanatomists use those peaks and valleys to decide how to draw a map of the human brain. So we're going to focus on that map, or the division of the human brain into different parts. The first big division is the two halves of the brain. You have a left half of your brain and a right half of your brain. Essentially, they're like having two brains in your head. Each brain, but they're connected to each other in the same way that a walnut, two halves of a walnut are connected to each other. The two halves of your brain complement each other by each serving a different side of the world. So it turns out there's a phenomenon called contralaterality. The left side of your brain controls the right side of your body, and the right side of your brain controls the left side of your body. It also works with the visual system. The left side of your visual field is controlled by the right side of your brain, the visual system in the right side of your brain. And the right side of your visual world, the right side of anywhere you look, is controlled by the left half of your brain. So the hemispheres differ a bit in function. Some people talk about the right brain and the left brain as having totally different functions. They're really they're much more complementary than they are independent. But there are a few functions that tend to live more strongly on one half of the brain than the other. And a big one is language. So it turns out that language, at least in almost all right-handed people, language is located in your left half of your brain, your left hemisphere. Okay, I said they're complementary. They work together. How do they work together? Well, there's a bridge that connects the right and left sides of your brain, and that bridge is called the corpus callosum. It's indicated here. You can see in the red areas. That's where the corpus callosum is. And for reasons of trying to treat epilepsy, there are people in the world who've had their corpus callosum cut so that the two halves of their brain function more independently. Now let me go back just a second. Epilepsy is a disorder where the neural activity in your brain sort of goes, it just goes crazy. It's like a fire, it's like a storm, it's like a wildfire of neural activity in your brain that you can't control. Imagine trying to walk across the street when you have an epileptic seizure and you can't control your body. It could be deadly under situations like that. So neuroscientists tried to control epilepsy by cutting the corpus callosum, because the thought there was, well, if there's a storm of neural activity in one half of the brain, at least the other half of the brain will be fine, because there won't be any way for that storm of electrical activity to get from one half of the brain to the other half of the brain in people who've had the bridge between the two halves, corpus callosum, cut. We call those people split brain patients. It's like they have two minds. What's fascinating about split brain patients is they get along just fine. You have to create these really unusual situations before you can see that there's something different about them. But what we know from studying split brain patients is that, like I said, one side of the world is controlled by the other brain, and the other side of the world is controlled by the other side of the brain. Okay, so if you do studies focused on what kind of processes happen in each side of the brain, one of the things you notice is a few, very small number, but a few kinds of specialization in one half of the brain versus the other. So we mentioned language. Language in the vast majority of people is located or depends on neural processes that happen in the left half of your brain. The left half of your brain is also a little better at logic and math. And the left half of your brain seems to analyze images, things that you see, by focusing on the details. We call that local analyses because it's little points in space. So the left half of your brain is very detail oriented. The right half of your brain seems to be a little better at spatial perception, figuring out where things are in space, and it's better at face perception and face recognition. And the right half of your brain tends to analyze things, not in the details, but in the big picture, globally. So there's this local versus global distinction that people talk about. Okay, next we're going to talk about the maps of the brain that divide the brain into different lobes or segments. So come back for that.